Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed. Hi, welcome to Writers in Focus. I'm your host, James Taylor, and today I'm delighted to meet one of my favorite new writers. His name is Michael Morris. May I call you Michael?
Absolutely, James. Thank you.
Michael, I'd like to welcome you to the Fulton County Government Center and the Atlanta Fulton Public Library. By way of introduction, we're going to talk about your latest novel. It's called Man in the Blue Moon, published by Tyndall House. Michael is the author of such acclaimed novels as A Place Called Wiregrass, Slow Way Home, and Live Like You Were Dying, based upon a country tune, I believe. Mm-hmm. All of these books were published to what I would consider universal praise. In fact, Man in the Blue Moon was honored as one of the best books of 2012 by Publishers Weekly in the religion category. We'll talk about that later. Some of Michael's most avid and fervid fans include Dolly Parton, Pat Conroy, and now me. He's a fifth-generation Floridian, now living in Birmingham, Alabama. Let's talk about Man in the Blue Moon, and I know you get this from all the people who have talked to you about this book in the last couple of months, but the book is dedicated to Curtis Pop Whitfield. Is that your grandfather?
Yeah.
Was that the man who received a box? You tell the story.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're heading down the right path. My grandfather, Curtis Whitfield, he was the greatest storyteller I've ever known, truly. And the way he could tell a story was hypnotic. He would sit on the edge of his easy chair and wave his hands. And he was such a good storyteller, you'd have to get him to tell it 2 or 3 times to mine out fact from fiction. But one story stayed the same, and it was this story about a man who was shipped in a crate from Bainbridge, Georgia, to his family down the Apalachicola River.
It sounds suspiciously like the novel we're about to talk about.
Yep, that's where I got the idea. I mean, the story really haunted me throughout my childhood, and I knew eventually I wanted to do something with it. And I guess the question is, why didn't I write it sooner? But I was intimidated of this story because it was so personal, and then also the time period at the turn of the century.
Right, 1918, something like that?
That's exactly right.
Let's talk about the novel first. I want the audience to get an idea of what this novel is about. It's 1918. It's the time of the Spanish influenza, just about circling the globe, something that's not really addressed in a lot of literature. World War I is winding down. It's Apalachicola, Florida, which was once one of the great... You talk about that. Well, you're the southerner here.
Well, we both love Apalachicola.
Yeah, I do.
And it is a great city. It's a port city, and a lot of people know it because the Weather Channel, whenever there's a hurricane, that's the pinpoint place they always turn to on the Florida map. But at one time, it was the 3rd largest exporter of cotton in the United States.
We forget that, yeah.
Yeah, and it was a thriving community. The French government actually had a consulate base there. And now the population is around 2,500, exactly where it was in its heyday, at 2,500.
Incredible.
And I have visited that town often throughout my life. My grandfather grew up in a little crossroads community called Weehawken, which is right near there. And so we'd always go through this town, and it was beautiful, rustic, and haunting at the same time. A lot of these warehouses that they once stored cotton, were dilapidated. Now people have come in and refurbished them and made some really unique stores out of them. But,
as I was telling you before the interview, and don't let this go to your head, okay? I read a lot of bad books. This is one of the best books I have read in years. You are a consummate storyteller. Pat Conroy was not kidding when he said that you are one of my favorite Southern writers. It's a story so beautifully told. We'll talk about the craft that went into it in a few minutes. But Michael, tell me about what's the plot?
Well, this real life story
Yep.
is part of it, and where in real life the man was shipped to my great grandfather, who was his distant cousin. So in Man in the Blue Moon, Lanier Stillis in Bainbridge, Georgia, is fleeing from his in-laws because his wife has been killed. He's been exonerated in court, but they still believe he killed her.
What a subplot that is, too. Let's leave that off the table. This is a family show.
Yeah, and yes. So they're seeking justice, vigilante
yeah.
justice, and he's shipped to his distant cousin, Harlan Wallace, outside of Apalachicola in this town called Dead Lakes. Well, unbeknownst to him, Harlan has an opium addiction, and he's run off.
That's Ella's husband who's
Yes.
run off, right?
And the main character, Ella, is struggling against foreclosure.
She's a young woman with three sons, the oldest of which is 16.
Yes, yes, and battling with her for head
Right.
of the household. And Ella is sort of a pampered woman. She was an orphan raised by her aunt.
She has an education.
Yes, yes.
In those days, women, yeah.
She's artistic.
Right.
And her husband sheltered her, but then his gambling addictions led to opium addiction, and he's gone, and she's got to learn to stand on her own 2 feet. And when she's struggling against emotional and financial collapse, this crate arrives, parcel paid, and she thinks it's a clock because it's coming from the Blue Moon Clock Company. She thinks I can at least sell this and try to pay off some of the debt. But boy, are they in for a surprise when they open that crate.
And so see if I can recapitulate out of memory. So here's Ella. She opens the crate, and this young man pops out, and he claims that he's a distant relative of her husband who's run off. The husband has an opium problem. He's a ne'er-do-well. He's a gambler. He's also sold the land to an unscrupulous, evil banker in town called, wait a second, Clive Gillespie.
Yeah.
And Clive Gillespie, a small Napoleonic, syndrome man,
Right.
wants this piece of land because there's a brother Mabry, am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Who believes that this area of Apalachicola might be the original site of Eden. Brother Mabry's wife believes that the waters have healing powers. On top of that, the man who gets out of the box does have healing powers. Am I saying that correctly?
That's it.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and so much of this is taken from truth. That's what's
No.
also, yeah. When my grandfather went to assisted living, we found the book Foxfire, and
yeah.
I'd never read it.
The Wigington stuff, yeah.
Yes, from the North Georgia mountains, and there's a whole section on people being able to heal thrush and to pull fire from bodies, and they believed that certain members of the community could do this. So I thought, wow, what if Lanier had
Right.
this ability, and then
Right.
you had this witch hunt take place in the community, and that was really his undoing.
Now, folks, imagine all of these plots and subplots interconnected, written beautifully with suspense and attention to period detail and attention to what I'll call sensory experience. But let's talk about your publisher right now. It's Tyndall House, which traditionally publishes Christian fiction, Bibles. They're the original publisher of the Living Bible, if I recall. Was that the basis on which Publishers Weekly said that this is one of the best religious books of 2012? Because it ain't there's religion in the book, but it ain't a religious book.
Well, thank you,
Do
James.
you know what I'm saying?
Yes, and I feel the same way.
Okay.
I mean, in fact, the acquisitions editor and I talked for about 2.5 hours, and I kept saying, this is not a religious book. And she agreed, but she thought that there were religious components. For example,
Yeah,
the
it's
healing,
fabulous, yeah.
the Foxfire account is that these people believe if you cite from memory, sort of pray this verse from Ezekiel in the Old Testament, that's
it
your
puts chills up and down my spine when Lanier does that.
yeah. And so she tied that to a religious component. I tend to see the book as more mystical,
Yes, yes.
spiritual, but not religious. It's certainly not evangelical. It's not religious. I don't write with an agenda,
Yeah.
so I don't think anybody's going to. I mean, I've had people tell me they were stunned when they saw who published it.
I was.
Yeah.
No, with all due respect to born-again Christians and evangelicals, this is not one of those books. let me see if I can segue off of this gracefully, to use a loaded term. It's also a very contemporary book because Lanier is exhibiting powers that may or may not be heathen, pagan. Let's talk about the sheriff and the evil banker Clive Gillespie, who tried to frame Lanier as some kind of either he's a charlatan or he's evil. Am I reading that correctly?
The banker?
Into the
Yeah. Troubled for sure.
Okay. Michael, what I'm trying to get at is that Lanier's power, he does have the power to heal, and it's something that he learned that he had in the mountains of North Georgia. His grandmother told him never to if you divulge the secret or say what I've said, you'll be cursed or something like that. And he doesn't really know what it is either. But some of the people in Apalachicola think that he's the mark of the devil. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Okay.
Because he's different.
There's a lot in here, Michael.
He's different. And
Yeah.
that's another theme to this novel to me is tolerance or intolerance. And I think that weaves itself in through Lanier in the community because they are certainly not tolerant of him. I mean, here you are in 1918 and you have this woman whose husband has run off and all of a sudden she has a man living on her property. And as the busybody Reverend's wife points out, a much younger man, I might add. That's one of her lines in the novel. So they're looking for something. And Ella's youngest son actually has thrush and is very ill. And to the point where one night he feels like he is suffocating and Lanier actually heals him by putting his mouth on him and pulling out the thrush, which is in Foxfire how they did it.
Right.
And then that leads to a whole other series of accusations.
It was incredible. Like the sheriff interrogates the people who saw this, and did Lanier put his lips on the boy in an unnatural act?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can see people in the 2013 saying that about a political opponent.
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a question that has come up from readers. You know, this is set in 1918, but we look at our current times, financial collapse, foreclosure, tolerance. I mean, these are all themes and topics that we're talking about today in 2013, just like they were in 1918.
Your writing is so good, I can't say that enough, but I have to ask you, as a fiction writer, you address issues in 1918 such as banking in small cities, faith healing, steamboats, the status of Creek Indians living amongst white people, shall we say, the status of black people living among white people. How much research did you do for a book like this?
Well, that's why I think I put off writing this story.
That's a good answer.
I did not know how to go about it. And, you know, to just praise libraries for a moment, I was all set
Yes.
Yeah, we want to praise them big time because I was all set to go to the University of Florida and research through their newspaper collection, newspaper articles of 1918 in Apalachicola. Well, the Birmingham City Library arranged for a loan where I was able to get them on microfilm.
Fantastic.
And go through them 1 week. And I found lots of ideas through looking through those newspaper stories. You know, the cost of coffee in different ads, or the influenza cures that they were trying to sell that was kind of snake oil at the time because there was such a hysteria about the Spanish flu. So all of these were aspects that I drew into it. And one thing I do want to add is, outrageous as that claim sounds that Brother Mabry makes, that was the original Garden of Eden.
Right.
Lo and behold.
If you go to Genesis,
Yes, he makes the claim, but there was another.
A river with 4 tributaries or something like that? Okay.
And flora that grows there that doesn't grow anywhere else in the world. Well, actually, there was a Baptist minister in the 40s, not in 1918, who tried to make that claim about a town near Apalachicola. And when I read that, I thought, this is too good to pass up.
It was incredible.
So that becomes his driving force. Of course, he's trying to use it to develop one of these spa retreats, which were so popular in that period of time, where people thought they could be cured of ailments like respiratory ailments if they
It was
come to
also the time
spring.
of Ouija boards. It was also the time of a great interest, a popular interest in the occult. And so when Brother Mabry's wife inadvertently bathes in these waters, it takes away her illness. Brother Mabry says, now wait a second, there's this water might have great religious import, and forgive me for looking at my notes, and Clive Gillespie says, if I can get the deed to this land, I'll be a millionaire because people will come here from all around the world. That's how much I like your book. I can just, it's right there, it's right there. Let me ask you, Michael, about how you got started as a writer, because I have not read a book like this in such a long time that it's a page turner, but there's no sentimentality in it. I never know what is going to happen. The ending is beautiful, but I didn't expect it to end that way. I don't want to give too much of the book away, but your craft. Let's talk about people like Lee Smith and Tim McLaren and stuff like that.
Well, I adore Lee Smith.
Okay.
And Tim McLaren was my guiding force early
Now, who are
on.
these people? These are great writers. The North Carolina Literary Mafia.
Yes, North Carolina Literary Mafia. And I didn't come into writing early, which now I'm older, it seems early, but I started writing at 31. And I wasn't one of these people who thought I would grow up being a writer.
You were a pharmaceutical salesman?
Yeah, I worked in pharmaceutical sales. I was the first in my immediate family to go to college. But looking back on it, I realized that I grew up in a family of storytellers. Like I mentioned, my grandfather. My grandmother was a great storyteller, loved to tell stories about family members. You know, she was fifth generation in the same county, so all of our relatives were buried in the same plot at the cemetery. So I loved hearing these stories. I love going to the cemetery and hearing these stories, and that's a gift. Because right now, I can go to that cemetery like I did over holidays, and I can walk by each grave, and I know the story of each of these people that go back generations.
Listen, we began the interview with my mentioning your grandfather, but in that wonderful essay you wrote for the Los Angeles Times in 2011, you said that your mother married, and I'm being personal, but it's there for anybody to read. Your father was an abusive, violent man. Who threatened your mother, you, your grandfather and grandmother basically took care of you. He was the kind of man, and not kind of man, he wore a cowboy hat and sometimes carried a gun.
Yeah.
I can see that, that's in the book too. I
Yeah.
mean, so that must be here I am, that's an extraordinary leap from that to being a pharmaceutical salesperson.
Yeah, it is. But you know, at the same time, when you're selling, you're building relationships, you're telling stories. I mean, my grandfather sold cars. He was a very successful car salesman, and I could just see him doing that because he was such a storyteller that he could connect to the people through his stories. So
I'm asking you something that I don't already know, like I'm a lawyer making a big mistake. When your grandfather died, he lived to be like 101, 102?
Right, 101.
Did he know that you were working on this story? Were you finished?
I had finished it.
Yeah.
His mind was strong up until about a year before he died. And so when I started writing this, I started writing it on his 99th birthday is when I started researching it. The first thing I did was take a tape recorder and do an oral history with him.
Wow.
Talking about this man in the box, but then also what life was like in that part of Florida. It was very hard Scrabble. This is not Disney World. This is hard Scrabble.
No magnolias in the front yard?
No, this is Wild West.
Yeah. People forget that.
Eye for an eye.
Yeah.
And he saw things like his brother get killed in a shootout with another man over a claim one of them was making moonshine. A man gets shot in the head for stealing cattle, and then the sheriff deemed it was justified because indeed the man had stolen the cattle. So these were the things that I kind of wove into this novel, is just setting up the place and the time period of that western part of Florida.
You've attended, you have a master's in fine arts and creative writing from Spalding University. You graduated from Auburn University. I'm of the opinion that you can't be taught how to write a book as good as this. How do you feel about that? Could you have written this without getting that creative writing degree. And there's a lot of people out there, Michael, who, they're going, I'm going to be a great writer, I'm going to go get my MFA and then, write a novel and blah, blah, blah. Your work moves me in such a way that I can't see it, how you learn this. It's got to come from the heart. I'm bubbling over, but it's true.
Well, thank you. The first two,
but you know what I'm asking.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do. And the first two novels I wrote before I got the MFA. I kind of did it backwards. Most people get the MFA, then they get published. Well, I had the idea of possibly teaching, so I knew I would need an MFA, and I spoke with the people who run the program and thought, well, I'll go back and get this MFA. But it exposed me to new work. And some of the things that were helpful to me, for example, were the playwriting classes I took. And I think it helped me to further develop the plot in this novel, because this is probably the most plot-driven of all my novels.
It's incredible. It's incredible. Let me segue into this, because I love great writing, and this is great writing. It's hard for a writer to convey a sensory experience, and I mentioned this before the interview. Near the end of the book, for whatever reason, the audience doesn't have to know, young Keaton takes a horse and buggy to Apalachicola to save his mother. He gets on a steamboat, and he's overwhelmed by the smells underneath, and the smells are of, and you convey that to the reader. And do you think about that when you're writing? I mean, it's really hard to do.
Well,
I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And when I visit the area, I am kind of overtaken by the smells there, the salt air.
Oh, Apalachicola,
the marsh.
Even a couple of years ago when I was there, still reeked of oyster shells and
yes,
dead fish.
Dead fish. I mean, it all kind of combines together, and it sounds like it would be nauseating.
We love you, Apalachicola, but still.
But to me, really, it kind of combines together, and it's on its own unique place, and that's what makes it so neat to me, as far as I can smell that and I know where I am. And I was just trying to imagine what life was like then, where you didn't have everything so sanitary, perhaps, as we have it now. And I just try to put myself in all of the characters, particularly the ones where I'm writing for their point of view. And in this novel, it's Keaton, it's Ella, and it's Lanier.
Right.
And writing to me is almost like acting in that sense, as you try to figure out what the character is thinking, what they would do, how they would respond. So I see these stories as movies in my head as I write them.
I like what you just said, because that can be taken either way. Like if one time I told a writer, I said, I meant it as an insult. I said, this reads like a movie. And he said, thank you, thank you. A famous writer of note. And I could visualize everything in this book. And it's so Southern, and I say that in the best sense of Southern. You've got a faith healer. You've got an evil banker. You've got horses, mules. You've got an African American community that you picture them as oppressed, but at the same time noble. All these cliches. I get myself into trouble when I talk that way. You've got faith healing. You've got religion. It's unbelievable.
Native American, which is something I had never explored.
Narisa, the Creek Indian, which is seldom addressed in literature. What happened to the Indians of Florida?
Yeah,
they just didn't go away.
Right, and the Creek Indians were, prominent of that part of the country, and one of the things I learned through research is that they were segregated, and I had never really thought of that. But they had their own section of the cemetery, and they were definitely segregated from the mainstream society.
One of the best books I have read in a long time. I promised you this, I promised myself. You're in town to visit a few friends and be on do a couple of interviews, but you're also here for an AIDS convention? Tell me about that.
Well, from my previous work with the pharmaceutical company, GlaxoSmithKline, I was involved with the Georgia AIDS Coalition, which does great work in testing and prevention and advocating for treatment. And I'm now on the board. And so I met with those folks last night, and we were talking about planning for the new year.
I can see a new novel coming out of this. At least I hope so. I'm just reviewing some of some of my notes. Alabama won last night. You were here in Atlanta going to the AIDS convention. What are you and your beautiful wife doing in Birmingham now?
Well, she's an artist.
I know. I saw her work on a TV show.
Yeah, and she did painting, actually. Her interpretation of what Ella's land would look like, because the land is such a central part of this novel. And for my key bookstores that have really supported me through the years, we did giveaways of the Giclée print.
Fantastic.
And that was a lot of fun. And everybody who bought a book was entered into this drawing. So she's busy with her art. And this weekend, we're actually going to Charleston, and I'm going to participate in a literary fundraiser that Mary Alice
With my old friend Brett Lott.
And Brett Lott.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, this comes from the bottom of my heart and the base of my brain. I read a lot of bad books. I read a lot of good books. This is a great book. It's by Michael Morris. It's his fourth novel. It's called Man in the Blue Moon. If you want a great read, go to your local library, run to your bookstore, and get a copy of Man in the Blue Moon by one of my favorite writers of all time, Michael Morris.
Wow, thank you so much.
You were super.
Thank you.
Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed.